It was the year 1305, and the streets of London were filled with the cries of merchants selling their products and the clatter of horse hooves on the pavement. On the other hand, on this particular morning in August, a different sound would soon fill the air, the roar of a throng that was assembling to watch what would become one of the most notorious executions in the history of the world. They came to see the death of William Wallace, the Scottish knight who had the audacity to oppose the English crown and unite his countrymen against foreign authority. They came to bear witness to his passing. What took place on that day was not merely a ritualistic death. Rather, it was a meticulously planned and executed act of cruelty with the intention of destroying not only a man, but also the symbol that he represented. Wallace's final moments have been sanitized into something almost noble, a fast death for a valiant hero, according to the common imagination, which has been formed by Hollywood films and romantic narratives. The actuality, on the other hand, was far more ominous and incomparably more violent. It was King Edward I, also known as Longshanks, who had devised the punishment for Wallace, not just as a form of retribution, but also as a message that would reverberate down the generations. The purpose of this execution was to serve as a warning to anyone who dared to defy the power of the English government, since it was going to be so horrifying, so public, and so carefully documented. A penalty reserved for traitors that marked the utmost peak of judicial severity in medieval England was chosen to be hanging, drawing, and quartering. This procedure was chosen because it was the most cruel type of punishment. This wasn't simply about terminating a life. It was about the systematic eradication of human dignity, the obliteration of hope, and the production of a spectacle so horrible that it would haunt the collective memory of Scotland for centuries to come. Over the course of today, we will dispel the myth and investigate the brutal reality of the final hours of William Wallace's life. To get a complete idea of the tragedy that was Wallace's execution, we must first get a sense of the world that was responsible for its creation. During the latter half of the 13th century and the early 14th century, Scotland was a land that was trapped between independence and servitude. At that time, the concept of nationhood was still in the process of developing, and loyalty was frequently established according to survival rather than sentiment. Edward I saw an opportunity to put Scotland under direct English authority, regarding the Northern Kingdom as a rebellious province rather than a sovereign nation. This was the result of the Scottish Wars of Independence, which had erupted as a result of a succession crisis. It was not as a lord seeking power that William Wallace emerged from this instability. Rather, he emerged as a modest landowner who was propelled by personal loss and national fury. His family had endured hardships as a result of the English occupation, and when he raised his sword at Stirling Bridge in 1297, he did so with the rage of a man who had lost everything and the vision of a man who recognized what Scotland had the potential to become. His victory there was more than just a tactical one. It was also symbolic, since it demonstrated that the English heavy cavalry could be overcome and that Scottish independence was not only a dream. However, Edward I was not a monarch who condoned disobedience. He was notorious for his harsh repression of Welsh opposition and his exile of Jews from England. Shanks was aware that rebellion was similar to fire in that it had the potential to spread if it was not completely quenched. Not only was it necessary to reverse Wallace's success, but it also needed to be made into a cautionary tale. In order to demonstrate that defying his power would result in consequences that were so severe that they would discourage future generations from even considering rebellion, the English king needed to deliver a convincing demonstration. Understanding Wallace's fate required a thorough comprehension of the political climate of the year 1305. The majority of Scottish nobles had already succumbed to Edward's reign at this point, as they regarded accommodation as a more desirable option than complete annihilation. As a result of Wallace's persistent resistance, he became not only an adversary of England, but also an embarrassment to the Scottish nobles, especially considering that they had elected to submit. In addition to being a priority for military reasons, his capture became a requirement for political ones as well. There was a question over the legitimacy of Scotland's surrender simply because he existed. The investigation into the whereabouts of William Wallace lasted for a number of years and involved a vast network of informants, spies, and participants. Edward placed a hefty premium on Wallace's head, and the English authority in Scotland moved methodically to isolate him from prospective followers. Wallace was so isolated from potential allies. Former allies increasingly turned against him, motivated by fear, money, or simply the need to survive in a world where connection with Wallace had become synonymous with death. This caused the net to gradually tighten. The act of betrayal originated from within, which is not uncommon in novels of this nature. In August of 1305, Wallace was taken captive close to Glasgow. It is quite likely that Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who had succumbed to English power, was the one who was responsible for his arrest. However, the consequence was crystal clear. The man who had become the emblem of Scottish resistance was now in the hands of the English. Historians continue to argue the specific circumstances surrounding this event. However, for Edward, his capture was just the beginning of what he planned to be Wallace's final humiliation. His capture was lauded as a tremendous victory in London, but for Edward, it was only the beginning. The travel from Scotland to London was a type of torture in and of itself, with the intention of breaking Wallace's spirit prior to the execution of his final punishment. In English towns, where crowds had come to witness the notorious Scottish rebel, he was paraded through the towns while being bound and guarded. The transformation of a hero into a spectacle and a leader into a curiosity was an example of psychological warfare at its most sophisticated level. Even though Wallace had already been subjected to weeks of humiliation by the time he arrived in London, his suffering was not even close to being ended. Despite the fact that the trial of William Wallace was a legal farce, it served an important propaganda purpose for the English monarchy. Latin was the language that was used during the proceedings, which took place at Westminster Hall on August 23, 1305. It is highly likely that Wallace did not comprehend Latin. Treason, murder, sacrilege, arson, and a variety of other offenses against the English crown were among the charges that were brought against him. The irony was not lost on those who were living during that time period. Wallace was being prosecuted for treason against a king whom he had never accepted as his sovereign. Reportedly, when Wallace was given the opportunity to speak, he stated that he could not possibly be guilty of. Because he had never been Edward's subject, this stubborn attitude sealed his doom due to the fact that he committed treason against Edward I, despite the fact that the conclusion had been fixed previously. The trial was a theatrical performance that was designed to provide the appearance of legal proceedings to what was, in reality, a prearranged execution. There was no intention on the part of the judges, who had all been nominated by Edward, to offer any mercy to the one who had become the emblem of Scottish resistance. Wallace was charged with a number of offenses that were meticulously designed in order to justify the severity of his sentencing. Treason was the most heinous offense, with the full horror of hanging, drawing, and quartering as punishments for those who committed it. In order to depict him as a criminal rather than a fighter, the extra charges of murder and sacrilege refer to his attacks on English soldiers and clergy. These allegations were brought against him because of his attacks. Wallace was to become the most notorious victim of the English judicial system, which had become a weapon of governmental terror against the English people. The sentence was proclaimed with the solemnity of a ceremonial ceremony. Wallace was to be taken through the streets of London, hanged by the neck, but not until he was dead, disemboweled while he was still alive, beheaded, and his body was to be divided into 4 sections. There was a symbolic significance attached to each component of this punishment. The drawing was a representation of his debasement, the hanging of his rejection by heaven, the disemboweling of his spiritual degeneration, and the quartering of his total ruin. An annihilation, not only an execution, was what took place here. There was a clear sky and a mild temperature in London on the morning of August 23, 1305. For several days, the city had been making preparations for this spectacular event, which included the construction of scaffolding and the gathering of spectators from all over England to see the execution of the Scottish rebel. A public holiday had been declared in honor of Wallace's death by the authorities, complete with vendors offering food and drink to the crowd that had gathered to see the event. This was not just about doing what was right. It was also about providing entertainment and serving as a reminder of the power that the English monarch possessed and the fate that was in store for those who dared to resist it. In the beginning, Wallace was stripped naked and tied to a hurdle, which was a wooden frame that would drag him through the streets of London. It had been meticulously thought out to maximize both the humiliation and the spectacle that would occur along the way. The procession began at the Tower of London, where he had been detained, and proceeded through the busiest parts of the city. This was done to ensure that the greatest number of people possible were able to witness his humiliation. As he was being dragged behind horses, the cobblestones tore at his flesh, creating a path of blood that served as a reminder of his last journey. People who were merely interested in seeing the pain of others, people who were English patriots, and people who were simply curious about the situation were all present in the masses that lined the streets. Executions during the Middle Ages were public events that served both as a form of entertainment and as a striking reminder of the power of the royal family. As Wallace drove by, the fans jeered at him and tossed trash at him. The authorities encouraged the actions of the people because they wanted to make sure that his last moments were as humiliating as possible. On a huge scale, this was brutality that was promoted by the state. Since the procession traveled at a leisurely pace, there was ample opportunity for. The masses gathered in order to prolong Wallace's misery, which they wanted to see. According to contemporary accounts, he remained conscious during the entirety of this ordeal, his eyes fixed on some distant place, as if he were able to look beyond the immediate horror of his condition. On the other hand, witnesses remarked that he never screamed out or begged for mercy, which is a fact that would later become a part of his legend. It is unknown if this was a show of defiance, resignation, or mere astonishment. An execution scaffold had been set up at Smithfield, which is the usual execution ground in London, for the purpose of carrying out Wallace's execution. The crowd was larger and more noisy here than it had been throughout the road, with vendors selling pies and ale to viewers who had claimed the best viewing positions many hours earlier. It was on purpose that the atmosphere was that of a festival. The English rulers wanted Wallace's murder to be remembered not as a martyrdom, but rather as a celebration of English justice and might. The executioner, a trained expert who had probably carried out dozens of such deaths, started his work with the same level of efficiency that he had become accustomed to. At first, Wallace was hung by the neck. However, the rope was positioned in such a way that it would assure that he would be strangled rather than that he would die quickly by breaking his neck. As the throng watched him struggle for oxygen, his face turned purple and his body convulsed in the universal dance of death by asphyxiation, he was surrounded by people who were watching him. At precisely the moment when his consciousness started to wane, he was cut down, still alive, and yet conscious of what was taking place to him. Following that came the most horrifying part of the entire incident that had taken place. The executioner started the process of disemboweling Wallace while he was still aware throughout the entire operation. He began the process of extracting the internal organs one by first cutting up the belly with a knife that was quite sharp. The screams of the victim were reported as being unlike anything the onlookers had ever heard before, a sound that seemed to originate from the depths of human sorrow itself, according to contemporary records. The executioner displayed each organ for the audience to see before hurling it into a fire that had been created specifically for the purpose of carrying out the execution. The symbolic significance of the act of burning Wallace's intestines was not a coincidence. In medieval philosophy, the bowels were supposed to be the location where feelings of compassion and emotion were stored. The executioner was degrading Wallace to something that was less than human in the eyes of the crowd by burning them while he watched. This was a symbolic act of erasing Wallace's humanity. The atmosphere was filled with the sulfurous odor of charred flesh and organs, which added an additional dimension of horror to a scene that was already terrifying. Wallace remained conscious during all of this, his eyes wide and aware of everything that was going on around him, even while his body was being slowly destroyed. Despite the fact that his words have been lost to history, there are reports that appear to indicate that he continued to talk. The executioner's talent lay not only in inflicting the greatest amount of anguish with the victim, but also in preserving the victim's life for as long as possible. The moment of death would not be the pinnacle of pain, but rather an escape from it. After what seemed like an eternity, the executioner finally moved to finish his gruesome work. With a single stroke of a keen axe, Wallace's head was cut, putting an end to his misery on the very last possible occasion. In spite of this, the hum continues to. After the head was displayed for the audience to witness, blood was still streaming from the severed neck. After that, the head was put aside for subsequent display. Following this, the body was chopped into 4 quarters, and each piece was displayed for the public to examine, much like the way slices of meat are shown at a butcher's shop. The manner in which Wallace's remains were disposed of was just as premeditated as his execution. It was hung on a spike on London Bridge, where it would remain for years as a warning to anybody who may consider defying English power. His head was preserved by being bathed in tar, and it was mounted on the spike. The 4 parts of his body were transported to other cities in Scotland, including Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, where they were exposed in public as a reminder of the destiny that was in store for those who rebelled against the government. In addition to being a kind of brutality, the distribution of Wallace's body parts was also a sort of political message. The local inhabitants received a message from each individual piece, which acted as a concrete reminder of the power that the English held and the repercussions of disobedience. It was believed by the English that symbols could be just as potent as armies, and the mutilated body of Wallace became a symbol of English rule over Scotland. As far as Edward I was concerned, the immediate aftermath of Wallace's execution was precisely what he had hoped for. The horrific spectacle had accomplished what it had set out to do. The Scottish resistance appeared to disintegrate in the face of such an overwhelming exhibition of English strength. There were a great number of people who had supported Wallace who either left the nation or succumbed to English control because they believed that no cause was worthy of taking such a terrible life. A symbol of resistance had been successfully converted into a warning against insurrection through the performance of the execution. Edward I, however, had made an error in his estimation of the Scottish reaction to Wallace's martyrdom. The fact that Wallace was executed in such a cruel manner actually served to strengthen the Scottish resistance, rather than to squash it. The terrifying nature of his passing served as a rallying cry for those individuals who refused to acknowledge the dominance of the English. According to legend, Robert the Bruce, who would go on to become King of Scotland, was inspired to take action by the spectacle of Wallace's execution. He saw in it the true face of English power, and he was motivated to action by it. In addition, the manner in which Wallace passed away had an impact on the strategies that were utilized by subsequent Scottish resistance movements. The lesson was crystal clear. Being captured by the English meant being subjected to unimaginable levels of torture and humiliation. This knowledge resulted in a more fierce and determined kind of combat, in which Scottish fighters wanted to die in battle rather than surrender. A culture of no quarter had been established as a result of Wallace's death, one in which mercy was neither predicted nor presented. The repercussions of the political situation were felt well beyond the borders of Scotland. As a demonstration of English tactics that could easily be transferred to them, other European countries viewed Wallace's execution with curiosity and horror. They saw it as a demonstration of English methods. It was the savagery of the execution that established a part of England's reputation, which contributed to the isolation that would later make English foreign policy more difficult to manage. The word of strength that Edward I had sent had been received, but so had the message of cruelty that he had sent. The documentation of Wallace's execution is extensive, and it is derived from a variety of contemporary sources that offer a picture of the event that is remarkably detailed. The execution is described in clinical detail in the Lannos Chronicle, which was written by English monks. The Lannos Chronicle also notes the reaction of the crowd and the length of time that Wallace endured his torture. Despite the fact that they are skewed toward the English point of view, these narratives offer a significant amount of information into the attitudes that medieval people had regarding justice and punishment. A different viewpoint on the execution can be found in Scottish sources, despite the fact that there are less to be found. According to the Chronicle of John of Foran, Wallace is portrayed as a martyr who faced death with dignity and courage. The narrative places special emphasis on the fact that he did not ask for mercy or give up his cause. Despite the fact that these narratives may be overly idealized, they do demonstrate the influence that Wallace's death had on the national consciousness of Scotland, as well as the transformation of a military defeat into a moral victory. The court documents that were kept during Wallace's trial and execution offer what is perhaps the most objective depiction of the events that took place. This collection of records, which has been maintained in the English National Archives, provides evidence of the meticulous planning that went into both the trial and the execution. The fact that every detail was documented, from the charges that were brought against Wallace to the disposal of his remains, gives the impression that the English authorities were aware of the historical significance of what they were doing. There are further layers of detail regarding the execution that are provided by witness accounts from both English and Scottish onlookers. Some people talk about the murderous enthusiasm of the mob, while others talk of the seeming dignity with which Wallace faced his fate. The complexity of the event and the significance it holds for many audiences is brought into focus by the various perspectives that have been presented here. The execution of William Wallace did not only have immediate political repercussions, but also left a legacy that lasted well beyond those effects. Over the course of several centuries, his narrative evolved into a fundamental myth of Scottish nationalism, motivating successive generations of Scots to fight against the dominance of foreign powers. As a result of the savagery of his execution, he was converted from a failed rebel into a figure of martyrdom and resistance, which proved to be more potent in death than he had been in life. It is also possible that the execution had an impact on the development of international law and ideas of human rights. In later years, legal academics would point to the treatment of Wallace as an example of judicial cruelty that breached fundamental norms of human dignity. It was partially as a response to excesses like as Wallace's execution that the idea that even opponents of the state deserved basic human treatment began to emerge. For example, Wallace was executed. It is possible to observe the cultural impact of Wallace's passing in the literature, art, and music that came into existence in the centuries that followed his passing. It has been repeated and retold throughout history, from medieval ballads to contemporary films, with each succeeding age discovering a new significance in the sacrifice that he made. In particular, the scene depicting the execution has developed into a potent emblem of the conflict between oppression and freedom, as well as tyranny and justice over time. The psychological burden that was placed on the people of Scotland was significant. A collective trauma was formed as a result of the lasting impact of Wallace's execution, which eventually became a part of the cultural identity of Scotland. With the help of a common recollection of suffering, the nation was brought together in ways that could not have been accomplished alone via military success. It was the horror of his death that turned into a source of strength, demonstrating that there are some things that are worth suffering for and that it is possible to maintain dignity even in the face of ultimate degradation. It was a statement about the nature of medieval justice and the relationship between ruler and subject that the method of execution that was chosen for Wallace, hanging, drawing, and quartering, was itself a statement. Those individuals who had violated the holy link that existed between the king and the subjects were the only ones who were allowed to undergo this particular form of death. Through the application of this principle to Wallace, Edward I was attempting to argue that all people living in the British Isles were his subjects, regardless of whether or not they acknowledged this fact. The fact that the execution was carried out in public was also a key factor. A theatrical performance that was intended to maintain social structures and political relationships via the use of spectacle was known as medieval justice. The execution of Wallace was possibly the most sophisticated performance of its kind during that age. It involved not only the physical devastation of the victim, but also the psychological training of the audience. Not only were they witnesses to justice, but they were also taking part in a ceremony that was symbolic of the might of the state. Based on the extensive recording of the execution, it appears that the English authorities were aware that they were establishing a historical event. The fact that every detail was meticulously recorded, from the path that the procession took to the disposal of the body parts, is evidence that this was done with the intention of being remembered thereafter. The purpose of the execution was not only to punish Wallace. Rather, it was to create a narrative that would serve the interests of the English for any number of centuries to come. It is imperative that nothing be ignored with regard to the international aspect of the execution. Around the Middle Ages, Europe was a highly networked civilization in which information spread rapidly and reputation was of the utmost importance. The execution of Wallace was observed by diplomats from other countries and publicized across the continent, which contributed to England's reputation as a power that was willing to employ severe methods in order to preserve control. Throughout the decades that followed, this reputation would have an impact on diplomatic ties. In the process of contemplating the horrifying event that was the execution of William Wallace, we are forced to face unsettling realities regarding the nature of humans and the use of power. People who had been conditioned to accept and even enjoy the systematic annihilation of another human being were the people who flocked to watch him suffer. These crowds were not monsters, but rather ordinary people who went to watch him suffer. This demonstrates the propensity for cruelty that exists within civilized society when it is given governmental legitimacy, as evidenced by their delight for the spectacle. In addition, the execution reveals how fast something spectacular may become something that is normal. Wallace's dismemberment was carried out by a trained professional who was an expert in the art of extending the duration of misery. Officials who were responsible for organizing the event were bureaucrats who followed the protocols that had been established. It is possible that the normalization of severe cruelty is far more frightening than the brutality itself, which suggests that civilization is always more fragile than we may assume it to be. An illustration of the unpredictability of political symbolism is provided by the transition of Wallace from a rebel to a martyr. In spite of the fact that Edward the Found meant for the execution to serve as a demonstration of the futility of resistance, it ended up creating a compelling symbol of the nobility of sacrificing one's principles. Its failure to serve as a deterrent was largely attributable to the excessive nature of the execution. The horror was so comprehensive that it elevated itself to a sublime level, going beyond its immediate aim to manifest as something more significant. The persistent fascination with Wallace's story is a reflection of our need for heroes who exemplify our best ideals, even in the face of the most extreme suffering, as well as even especially in the face of such suffering. It is through his execution that we are reminded that the most significant victories are sometimes moral rather than military, that dignity may be preserved even when all else is taken away, and that the human spirit can prevail even in the moment when the body is being destroyed. When everything is said and done, the narrative of William Wallace's execution is ultimately a story about the cost of freedom and the cost of principle. When we live in a contemporary, comfortable world, it is easy to forget that the liberties that we take for granted were purchased with the blood and suffering of those who came before us. The tragic death of Wallace serves as a reminder that freedom is never truly free, and that those who take pleasure in it have a duty to respect the sacrifices made by those who gave their lives for it. Wallace's story maintains its relevance in the present day, when we are confronted with our own challenges to freedom and human decency. Despite the fact that the techniques have not changed, the underlying conflict between oppression and liberty has not been resolved. Because of his execution, we are reminded that there are causes that are worth dying for, that there are beliefs that are worth suffering for, and that the decision between freedom and security is one that each younger generation must decide for itself. Even after being broken, the human spirit may nevertheless inspire others to carry on, as evidenced by the blood-soaked cobblestones of medieval London, which continue to reverberate with the message that certain things are worth any price.